August 31st, 1939 did not announce itself with sirens or speeches. It arrived quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as just another late summer day across Europe. In London, office workers folded newspapers under their arms and hurried toward trains, reading cautious headlines that danced around the truth without naming it. The word crisis appeared often, but war remained avoided, as if speaking it aloud might summon the thing itself. Beneath the surface, however, government ministries were already operating under emergency assumptions. Files were being duplicated, evacuation plans finalized, and military liaisons kept on standby. Britain had learned, after Munich, that hope could be dangerously misleading, yet the psychological weight of accepting another continental war was immense. For ordinary people, the tension manifested as unease rather than panic, a sense that something irreversible was approaching, even if no one yet knew the hour. Berlin, by contrast, had moved beyond uncertainty entirely. The German capital functioned with a sharp, almost mechanical focus, the product of years of militarization and ideological conditioning. Senior officers and party officials passed through corridors of power with rehearsed efficiency, their movements guided by plans that had been refined long before diplomacy officially failed. Adolf Hitler was not improvising on August 31st. He was executing a vision he believed history itself demanded. The German state had fused political authority, military command, and propaganda into a single instrument, and that instrument was now pointed eastward. Hitler's confidence stemmed not only from military readiness, but from his belief that the international system lacked the will to resist him. Austria had fallen without a fight. Czechoslovakia had been dismantled by negotiation. In his mind, Poland would be no different. Within the German high command, the atmosphere was disciplined but not universally enthusiastic. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, meticulously recorded events in his diary, revealing a leadership class that understood the magnitude of what was about to unfold, even if they felt powerless to stop it. Operational orders for Fall Weiss, the invasion of Poland, were complete. Timetables had been synchronized down to the hour. Panzer divisions were positioned for rapid penetration. Infantry units prepared to follow and consolidate, and the Luftwaffe stood ready to strike communication hubs and civilian centers alike. There was little room left for dissent. Some officers privately feared British and French intervention, but the prevailing assumption was that any response would be slow, hesitant, and politically constrained. Germany was betting on speed, not just on the battlefield, but in decision-making itself. Poland entered August 31st in a far more precarious psychological position. Marshal Edward Rydzyszmigli understood the strategic dilemma facing his country better than most civilians ever would. Poland's geography made defense extraordinarily difficult. Long borders, few natural barriers, and enemies on multiple fronts. While Polish intelligence tracked German troop movements with growing alarm, there was little they could do to alter the imbalance. Polish forces were brave and numerous, but poorly equipped to counter massed armor and coordinated air power. Still, surrender was never considered. The Polish leadership believed that resistance itself mattered, that holding out long enough would force Britain and France to act decisively. It was a gamble born of necessity rather than optimism. In Warsaw and other major cities, daily life continued under the weight of restrained dread. Schools remained open, factories operated, and churches quietly filled with worshippers seeking reassurance rather than miracles. Radio broadcasts spoke carefully, emphasizing national unity and resolve while avoiding explicit descriptions of the danger ahead. Families discussed contingency plans in whispers. Where to go if bombing began, how to find relatives if transportation failed. Yet few imagined the scale of violence that modern war would unleash. The idea that entire towns could be annihilated in minutes by aircraft was still abstract to many civilians. The memory of World War I lingered, but this new war would not resemble the old one in its pace or its reach. To the east, the Soviet Union observed events with calculated patience. Only days earlier, the Molotov, Ribbentrop Pact had stunned the world, shattering ideological assumptions about Nazi-Soviet hostility. Publicly framed as a pragmatic non-aggression agreement, it concealed secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into zones of influence with chilling precision. Joseph Stalin viewed August 31st not as a moment of crisis, but as a strategic pause. By allowing Germany to strike first, the Soviet Union preserved its forces while positioning itself to expand westward later. Red Army units near the Polish border waited under strict orders, their presence invisible to the outside world but decisive in the fate awaiting Poland. In Britain, the sense of inevitability had grown heavier with each passing hour. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, still haunted by the promise of peace for our time, now faced the collapse of that vision. Gas masks were distributed to civilians, blackout procedures rehearsed, and evacuation plans for children finalized. Winston Churchill, though not yet Prime Minister, spoke with increasing urgency in private and public forums, warning that delay itself had become a strategic liability. Britain's leaders understood that war would not simply be a continental affair. It would be total, involving cities, industries, and civilian morale on an unprecedented scale. France, meanwhile, remained psychologically anchored to the previous war. The Maginot Line symbolized not only military doctrine, but national trauma, a concrete attempt to prevent the horrors of 1914 to 1918 from repeating. French generals believed that time favored defense, that Germany would exhaust itself against fortified positions. What they underestimated was how thoroughly Germany had redefined warfare. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was a philosophy that emphasized disruption, momentum, and psychological collapse. On August 31st, French soldiers waited confidently behind walls that felt immovable, unaware that the decisive battles would occur elsewhere and far faster than anticipated. Across the Atlantic, the United States maintained formal neutrality, but American military institutions watched Europe closely. President Franklin D. Roosevelt balanced public isolationism with private concern, understanding that American security could not remain detached forever. Within the U.S. Army, officers analyzed German doctrine with professional fascination. Among them was George S. Patton, Jr., who viewed the unfolding crisis as validation of his long-standing arguments about armored warfare and aggressive leadership. To Patton, August 31st represented the final proof that hesitation was deadly and that future wars would be decided by speed, initiative, and psychological dominance. Diplomacy did not cease on August 31st, but it had lost its power to alter outcomes. Embassies transmitted last-minute cables, ambassadors requested audiences, and formal language continued to mask the reality beneath it. These gestures served more as documentation for history than genuine efforts at prevention. Armies do not wait for speeches to move. They move when logistics are complete and confidence is secured. Ammunition dumps were stocked, fuel depots filled, and communications networks tested. The machinery of war was already humming, indifferent to appeals and declarations. That evening, Adolf Hitler gathered his senior commanders for final instructions. His words, later recalled by those present, revealed the moral framework that guided his decisions. Victory, he insisted, would define truth itself. International law, public opinion, and moral restraint were obstacles to be overcome, not principles to be respected. The room responded with silence, a silence shaped by obedience, fear, and the momentum of events already in motion. No one in attendance could plausibly claim ignorance of what was coming. As darkness spread across Poland, border towns settled into uneasy sleep. In places like Weilen, there were no air raid sirens, no warnings, no defensive preparations worthy of the threat approaching. Civilians slept believing that even if war came, it would come with notice. They did not know that orders had been given to strike without declaration, to maximize shock and disorientation. The Luftwaffe pilots prepared their aircraft, knowing that their first targets would not be military installations alone, but symbols of civilian life. History would later mark September 1st, 1939, as the official beginning of World War II, but that date obscures a deeper truth. The war had already begun before the first bomb fell, before the first shot was fired. It began in assumptions left unchallenged, in aggressions rewarded rather than punished, in fear mistaken for prudence. August 31st, 1939 was not the last day of peace. It was the day peace finally ran out of excuses. September 1st, 1939, dawned over Poland like any ordinary morning to the untrained eye, but beneath the horizon, the machinery of war roared to life. At 4:45 a.m., German forces crossed the Polish border along multiple axes. The 4th Panzer Division under General George Hans Reinhardt moved toward the city of Katowice, while infantry units under General Johannes Blaskowitz pressed northward. Artillery fired in calculated bursts, signaling the opening of Fall Weiss. Polish border guards, armed with outdated rifles and light artillery, attempted to resist but were quickly overwhelmed by coordinated armor and air support. The first cries of panic rose from villages like Mikolo and Gliwice, where families watched as columns of tanks and trucks streamed past, seemingly unstoppable. The Luftwaffe unleashed an initial wave of bombing, targeting railways, bridges, and communication hubs, demonstrating the ruthless efficiency of modern air-ground coordination. Dive bombers tore through early morning fog, dropping ordnance with precision that would have seemed unimaginable just a decade earlier. Civilians in towns like Weilen, already on edge from rumors the night before, found themselves trapped in an inferno without warning. According to survivor accounts, entire streets vanished beneath the explosions within minutes, leaving families with no choice but to flee blindly or perish. This was war conducted at the speed of technology and intent, leaving no space for the illusions of chivalry or delay. In Warsaw, city leaders scrambled to respond. Mayor Stefan Starzyński, aware that panic could be as deadly as bombs, began mobilizing volunteers and reinforcing critical structures. Telephone lines were overwhelmed with citizens calling for guidance. Soldiers were rushed to the front, though many lacked sufficient ammunition and modern weaponry. Marshal R.Y. Smigly convened an emergency meeting with divisional commanders, urging calm and coordinated resistance. Orders were hastily transmitted. Defensive positions reinforced along the Vistula River, anti-tank obstacles erected, and artillery strategically repositioned to cover key roadways. Despite the preparations, the pace of the German advance quickly outstripped the Polish response. At the German High Command, Hitler monitored the invasion with the detachment of a man watching a long-anticipated plan unfold. From his Berghof headquarters, he received updates from Generals Halder, Keitel, and von Brauchitsch, each reporting progress, obstacles, and local resistance. Halder's diary notes describe Hitler's glee at the early success, but also reveal his impatience when resistance slowed, even briefly. "Time is the essence," he wrote, quoting Hitler. "We do not negotiate with hesitation." Across Germany, radio networks broadcast partial reports to the public, framing the invasion as a defensive measure to secure Germany's borders, though the truth was evident to anyone following troop movements. In France, the Maginot Line's commanders observed the news with anxiety tempered by doctrine. They had prepared for years to defend against a repeat of the First World War's slow, attritional campaigns, not for the lightning strikes of mechanized warfare. Generals Maurice Gamelin and Alphonse Juin debated the reports with disbelief and caution. They could see German forces advancing through Poland, but the immediate threat seemed distant, like watching a storm approach from a far horizon. In reality, the speed of Fall Weiss would soon reveal the inadequacy of static fortifications and force Allied planners to reconsider assumptions about mobility, communication, and readiness. Meanwhile, Britain's government held emergency meetings at Whitehall. Chamberlain and his war cabinet were confronted with intelligence from the front lines, along with urgent pleas from Polish envoys demanding immediate military support. Air Vice Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding reported that the Royal Air Force could not yet project power across Europe and naval deployments were similarly constrained. Winston Churchill, still out of official government office, met privately with colleagues and journalists, warning that indecision could cost millions of lives. His words carried both historical insight and prophetic urgency. The war unfolding in Poland was a test of alliances, strategies, and the moral resolve of nations. In the United States, military observers like Eisenhower, then a relatively junior officer, and George S. Patton Jr., absorbed reports with growing alarm. They studied German movements, noting the unprecedented coordination of air, armor, and infantry, and debated potential lessons for future conflicts. Patton, especially, began sketching conceptual strategies for rapid armored advances, which he would later refine in North Africa and Europe. Roosevelt, aware of public opposition to war, continued to tread carefully in diplomatic statements, but internal planning for eventual American involvement accelerated. Back in Poland, civilians and soldiers alike faced the terrifying reality that war was not theoretical. Families attempted to flee cities along secondary roads, only to encounter panzer divisions sweeping eastward, cutting off escape routes. Smoke from bombed towns obscured vision for miles, while artillery shells tore through bridges and rail lines. Field hospitals, understaffed and undersupplied, prepared to receive waves of wounded. Polish officers struggled to maintain communication between units scattered across the countryside, highlighting the profound impact of technology, strategy, and preparation, or lack thereof, on survival. German officers, while executing the invasion, also grappled with the human dimension of their actions. Halder's diary records moments of unease, noting that towns were being destroyed, civilians were fleeing, and resistance, though minimal, still exacted casualties. Even within the ranks, some soldiers expressed quiet concern over the speed and ruthlessness of the campaign, questioning orders but adhering to discipline. Rommel, though not yet in Poland, observed from reports and mentally prepared for campaigns that would later bring him to fame in France and North Africa, analyzing the efficiency of combined arms and the psychological effects on both enemy and his own troops. The night of September 1st brought little relief. Warsaw's streets were darkened under blackout orders, yet fires from bombed towns illuminated the horizon. Civilians huddled in cellars and basements, listening to distant artillery. Soldiers rotated through exhausted shifts, maintaining defensive positions while aware that reinforcements were not yet arriving. Marshal R.Y.D. Smigly moved among units personally, offering encouragement, delivering orders, and witnessing firsthand the strain on men expected to defend a country already overrun by superior mechanized forces. Meanwhile, the German High Command planned the next day's operations. Reconnaissance units reported on Polish troop movements, identifying weak points and logistical choke points. Commanders adjusted their plans, demonstrating flexibility within an overarching doctrine of speed and decisive engagement. Hitler demanded constant updates, his impatience evident in recorded meetings, while Keitel and von Brauchitsch balanced the operational realities with his expectations. The human dimension of command, stress, overconfidence, and judgment played as much a role in the unfolding campaign as tanks or artillery. Across Europe, neutral nations watched and calculated. Sweden, Switzerland, and the Netherlands took careful note of the invasion, aware that German aggression might one day reach their borders. Diplomatic cables flowed in multiple directions, outlining possibilities, threats, and potential alignments. Observers noted the efficiency of German logistics and command, understanding that Poland was not merely a test of arms, but a rehearsal of tactics that could soon be applied elsewhere. The political and military reverberations of August 31st would shape alliances, trust, and strategic assumptions for years to come. By the end of the first day of invasion, the scale of the conflict was undeniable. German forces had advanced deep into Polish territory, but resistance, though overwhelmed, was not extinguished. The human cost was immediate, and the lessons for both sides were stark. Modern warfare had arrived with a ferocity that erased the illusions of static front lines, ceremonial battle, and limited objectives. Leaders at every level, political, military, and civilian, were confronted with decisions whose consequences could no longer be predicted by tradition or past experience alone. Even as darkness fell, August 31's events continued to echo. In homes, military headquarters, and government offices, the weight of what was happening settled heavily. Europe had crossed an invisible threshold. The peace that lingered was now fragile, and the coming days promised chaos, suffering, and strategic reckoning on a scale unmatched in history. Every decision, every misstep, every act of courage would contribute to the unfolding story, a story whose impact would extend far beyond borders, shaping the trajectory of nations and the lives of millions. By the early hours of September 2nd, 1939, German forces had already penetrated deep into Polish territory, leaving a path of destruction that civilians could scarcely comprehend. In the town of Częstochowa, families emerged from cellars to witness entire streets leveled by precise Luftwaffe bombing raids. The 4th Panzer Division under General George Hans Reinhardt advanced along main roads, supported by infantry units executing flanking maneuvers. Polish defenders, though courageous, faced an enemy with overwhelming firepower and speed, forcing retreat after retreat. Every destroyed building, every severed railway line, was a reminder of how mechanized warfare had redefined the battlefield, reducing centuries-old notions of fortifications and traditional combat to near irrelevance. In Warsaw, Marshal Edward Rydzyszmigli and his staff worked tirelessly to coordinate the defense of the capital. Artillery batteries were hastily repositioned to cover key avenues, and volunteer militias were organized alongside exhausted regular units. Communications were chaotic, with telephone lines frequently destroyed by airstrikes. Couriers risked their lives to carry orders across shattered roads. Civilians, aware of the approaching armored divisions, fled homes in panic, carrying what little they could save. Mayor Stefan Starzyński coordinated emergency shelters while personally visiting frontline units to boost morale, embodying the principle that leadership in crisis is as much about presence and courage as about strategy. The German High Command observed the unfolding operations with intense scrutiny. Hitler received daily briefings from Halder, Keitel, and von Brauchitsch, each outlining gains, resistance pockets, and logistical considerations. Despite their reports of overstretched supply lines and exhausted troops, Hitler demanded continuous forward momentum. Rommel, analyzing reports from reconnaissance units, studied the tactics with fascination, noting how armored spearheads exploited gaps in Polish defenses with rapid decision-making and psychological pressure. Every movement illustrated a new paradigm of warfare, one that relied on speed, coordination, and relentless initiative. In France, General Maurice Gamelin and his staff debated whether to launch an offensive into the Saar, but uncertainty and outdated assumptions delayed action. The Maginot Line, a symbol of French security, offered little strategic advantage against the fast-moving German strategy. British intelligence reported the progress of Fall Weiss with growing alarm, while Prime Minister Chamberlain's War Cabinet weighed the implications of intervention. Winston Churchill, though still out of formal office, criticized the indecision, writing privately that the fate of Poland would test the credibility of Allied promises and the courage of nations. Polish commanders faced crises that were both tactical and moral. Brigadier General Stefan Rowecki, overseeing units in western Poland, repeatedly requested reinforcements that could not arrive. Communication breakdowns forced officers to make decisions independently, creating uneven resistance along the front. Soldiers were left to judge when to hold, retreat, or counterattack, knowing that every choice could cost hundreds of lives. The weight of command was immediate and unrelenting, illustrating how leadership under fire demands both strategic thinking and moral courage simultaneously. In smaller towns, civilians witnessed the war's brutality firsthand. Streets were destroyed, homes reduced to rubble, and schools demolished. Diaries later recounted the surreal juxtaposition of everyday life and sudden devastation. Breakfast interrupted by bombings, errands abandoned for shelter, and the constant hum of engines signaling approaching armored columns. Religious leaders tried to provide guidance and solace, though their words could do little against the material and psychological devastation sweeping the landscape. This was modern war in its rawest form, indifferent to tradition, morality, or human expectation. German soldiers, executing the invasion, experienced their own mix of exhilaration and apprehension. Letters to family back home reveal young soldiers impressed by their own efficiency, but troubled by the destruction they witnessed. Officers like Heinz Guderian focused on operational execution, analyzing how speed, armor, and air support could combine to crush resistance. The tension between obedience and conscience became apparent, highlighting that even victors are shaped by the psychological and ethical dimensions of war. By the afternoon of September 2nd, German forces had encircled several Polish units near the Vistula River, cutting off supplies and isolating soldiers from reinforcements. Eyewitness ordered strategic withdrawals, recognizing the impossibility of holding every position. Despite heavy casualties, Polish troops executed these maneuvers with discipline and determination. The interplay between morale, leadership, and battlefield innovation became clear. Courage and ingenuity could not always win a battle, but they could sustain hope and preserve lives. Civilians faced unimaginable choices. Families abandoned homes, carrying whatever possessions could be salvaged. Evacuation routes were blocked or destroyed by advancing forces, and towns like Weilen and Mikolo experienced devastating air raids. The psychological toll on children and elders was immense, leaving marks that would be remembered for generations. The human cost of strategy and planning became evident, showing that war is as much about human endurance as it is about military movements. Across the Atlantic, American observers continued to track the invasion with growing concern. Patton and Eisenhower studied German tactics in real time, debating implications for future armored campaigns. Patton wrote in his diary that the campaign was a brutal confirmation that speed, initiative, and shock could determine victory in modern warfare. Roosevelt, aware of domestic reluctance to enter the conflict, began preparing contingency plans, understanding that Europe's unraveling peace could have long-term implications for the United States. As night fell over Poland, towns braced for ongoing attacks. Fires from bombed villages illuminated the horizon, while Polish troops rotated through defensive positions with exhaustion written on every face. Leadership under pressure became a central theme. Officers like Rowecki and Eyewitness worked tirelessly to maintain order and resolve, demonstrating the personal courage required to uphold morale amid chaos. Civilians endured constant fear, understanding that survival depended as much on improvisation as on strategy. By the morning of September 3rd, German forces controlled much of western Poland. Reports indicated destroyed towns, trapped units, and waves of refugees moving towards central and eastern cities. Hitler's impatience at delays created friction within the high command, with Halder and other generals concerned about overextension. The unfolding campaign showcased both the advantages of planning and mobility and the limits of even the most meticulously executed strategies when confronted by human resistance and unpredictable terrain. That afternoon, Britain and France formally declared war on Germany, honoring treaties with Poland. While the declarations were significant diplomatically, their immediate impact on the battlefield was limited. Polish soldiers and civilians had already endured 3 days of relentless assault, highlighting the lag between political commitment and tangible action. The human cost remained immense, but the declarations underscored the broader geopolitical implications and the interconnectedness of alliances and military strategy. By the end of the 3rd day, the early phase of the war revealed fundamental truths about modern conflict. Speed, coordination, and psychological impact were decisive factors. Civilians endured terror, displacement, and loss. Commanders faced extraordinary moral and tactical dilemmas. The events of August 31st through September 3rd, 1939, showed that warfare was no longer confined to the battlefield. It enveloped entire societies, political systems, and international alliances. Lessons in leadership, resilience, and human endurance became as critical as tactical successes. As you reflect on the first 3 days of World War II, consider this. If you were a civilian in Poland, would you flee, fight, or hide? Could the decisions of leaders like Marshal Rydz or Mayor Starzyński have changed the outcome? And what would you have done under such pressure? How might the Allies' delayed intervention have altered history? What does courage mean when the odds are overwhelmingly against you? Does it reside in soldiers, leaders, or civilians? How do speed, surprise, and coordination shape victory and defeat in war? Could these lessons apply to modern challenges, both military and civilian? What moral responsibilities do commanders bear when civilian lives are at stake? How does witnessing history in such vivid detail change your understanding of leadership, strategy, and the human cost of conflict?